A ship is a living thing, Captain Taimichi Hara once wrote. And like a living thing, it can bleed to death if you cannot stop the wounds in time. On the morning of November 13, 1942, as the smoke of the naval battle of Guadalcanal still clung low over Iron Bottom Sound, Japanese officers scanning the horizon saw something that made no tactical sense. American ships, some burning, some visibly torn open by shells and torpedoes, were not withdrawing to distant home ports. They were still there, still moving, still fighting. By every lesson taught at the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima, this should not have been possible. Just days earlier, U.S. cruisers like USS San Francisco CA-38 had taken brutal punishment. Shell hits that killed Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, shredded bridge structures, and flooded compartments with seawater and blood. In Japanese doctrine, such damage meant months, sometimes a year out of action. A wounded ship was a strategic loss. Yet by late November, Japanese reconnaissance reported the impossible. Those same American hulls were reappearing in combat zones, repaired, rearmed, crewed, ready. For Japanese officers trained to believe that industrial endurance decided wars slowly, this speed was unsettling. The secret did not lie in magic or luck. It lay in steel, sweat, and an industrial philosophy that treated time itself as a weapon. On December 7, 1941, while Japanese carrier pilots were returning from Pearl Harbor, American shipyard clocks were already ticking. At Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, Mare Island, Puget Sound, and later Espiritu Santo and Ulithi, thousands of civilian workers, many of them women, many never having seen a warship before, worked in round-the-clock shifts under arc lights that turned night into artificial day. Japanese naval intelligence understood tonnage. They counted holes. What they did not understand was tempo. In January 1942, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese officers were briefed that American battleships like USS West Virginia and USS California were permanently neutralized. Fires had burned for days. Hulls lay sunken in shallow water. Oil still leaked across the harbor's surface. But by July 1942, USS West Virginia was refloated. By July 1944, she would be firing broadsides at Surigao Strait, annihilating the Japanese southern force. The disbelief among Japanese officers was not abstract, it was personal. Commander Masatake Okumiya, a staff officer later interviewed after the war, recalled studying American damage reports captured in the Solomons. He said, "We assumed they exaggerated their repairs for propaganda, but then we met the same ships again." At Tulagi in August 1942, Japanese pilots reported sinking U.S. destroyers. Days later, those destroyers were escorting convoys again, their scars still visible, hull plates warped but functional. American crews joked that paint dried slower than repairs. For Japanese sailors, this was not just frustrating, it was psychologically destabilizing. Imperial Japanese naval culture prized perfection. Ships were maintained meticulously, but repairs were centralized, slow, and conservative. A damaged cruiser was sent back to Kure or Yokosuka, or skilled artisans worked carefully, often replacing entire sections rather than improvising. The Americans did the opposite.
Function was everything. Japanese officers, trained to view warships as refined instruments, watched in disbelief as American vessels returned to battle looking unfinished, ugly, scarred, but operational. On March 27, 1943, after the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands, the heavy cruiser USS Salt Lake City CA-25 limped away with her engines failing and her hull holed. Japanese commanders believed her doomed. Instead, she reached port, underwent emergency repairs, and was back in action within weeks. The speed was not just physical, it was organizational. American damage control doctrine emphasized decentralization. Every sailor was trained to fight fires, plug leaks, and reroute systems. Japanese crews, by contrast, relied heavily on specialized teams. When those teams were killed, damage control often collapsed. Japanese officers noticed this difference during night battles in the Solomons. American ships, even when hit, did not fall silent. Guns kept firing, radar kept tracking, engines kept turning. On July 6, 1943, after the Battle of the Kula Gulf, Japanese lookouts watched as U.S. cruisers, one of them later identified as USS Honolulu CL-48, withdrew trailing smoke but under their own power. Honolulu had taken a torpedo that tore open her hull. She was back in combat by October. For Japanese planners, this shattered assumptions. War plans drafted before 1941 assumed that attrition favored Japan in the early phase. Damage inflicted on American ships would reduce pressure for months. Instead, damage barely bought weeks. Behind this reality were places Japanese officers never saw. At Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington, winter rains soaked workers as they labored on ships fresh from the Pacific. Men slept in cars between shifts. Welders burned through gloves and skin alike. The smell of ozone and oil hung permanently in the air. At Pearl Harbor, after the initial chaos, repair docks became assembly lines of controlled urgency. Battleships were cut apart and rebuilt faster than Japanese intelligence thought physically possible. Bureaucracy was bypassed. Authority was delegated. Japanese officers, accustomed to rigid chains of command, struggled to understand this flexibility. By 1944, the disbelief turned into dread. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19 to 20, 1944, Japanese pilots reported hitting multiple American carriers. Some hits were confirmed, fires were seen, explosions recorded. Yet by October 1944, at Leyte Gulf, those same carriers or their replacements were present in overwhelming numbers. Some wore patched decks and mismatched paint. None were absent. Japanese Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, watching the American fleet's apparent endless regeneration, reportedly remarked that fighting the U.S. Navy was like trying to empty the sea with a bucket. For Japanese officers raised to believe morale and spirit could compensate for material inferiority, this realization cut deeply. Courage could not outpace a shipyard that worked 24 hours a day. On damaged American ships, sailors returned to action still smelling of smoke and welding fumes. Some slept beside the very plates that had replaced shattered steel days earlier. They knew their ships were not perfect. They trusted them anyway. Japanese ships, when damaged, often waited, and waiting in a war of speed was fatal. By 1945, the contrast was absolute. At Ulithi Atoll, a floating city of repair docks and tenders, American ships rotated through maintenance with industrial efficiency. Japanese submarines occasionally observed the anchorage and reported unbelievable activity. They were not exaggerating. When the war ended, Japanese naval officers studying American logistics finally understood what they had been seeing all along. It was not just faster repairs, it was a different philosophy of war, one that treated destruction as temporary and recovery as inevitable. Ships could be broken, they could be burned, they could be scarred, but they would return. And for the Japanese officers who watched the same American hulls appear again and again on the horizon, freshly repaired and impossibly fast, that realization came too late to change the course of the war, but early enough to haunt them long after the guns fell silent.